Hey there, listeners. A quick new update for you that I promise is going to be shorter than the last one. First off, Patreon members at $5 a month or higher will be able to listen to ad-free episodes starting at episode 100 and going forward for basically as long as this podcast keeps going. You can listen either in the Patreon app or through Spotify, where you can get an exclusive RSS feed available only to Patreon members. This is one of the easiest ways to support the podcast for just $5 a month, and I hope you enjoy your ad-free experience. Second, those single barrels are almost here. The Barrel Rye, finished in Armagnac and picked with This Is My Bourbon Podcast, and the 2 Jack Daniel's Barrel Proof Ryes are on their way. Patreon members will have exclusive discounts and prime access. Even $1 a month means you'll have a few hours more to get those bottles before they're released to the public. Last thing, there are now 2 spots available in the monthly Bottle Share Club available to patrons at the $25 a month tier. If you're interested, I wouldn't hesitate. I expect the spot to go quickly. If it looks like it's all filled up and you're still interested, shoot me an email and we'll see if we can open up just one more spot. With that, thanks everyone, and enjoy this episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are once again traveling literally around the world to still the same day, just barely, but to the far east coast of Australia to visit Cape Byron Distillery. And to talk about that, we've got Eddie Brook, founder and CEO, up super late for us, all the way from Australia. Eddie, welcome on.
Thanks, David. Great to be here, mate. It's in the late hours of Friday here, so I've got a whiskey in front of me, and really stoked to be on the show, mate, and chatting all things whiskey.
Awesome. So before we get too into things, I just want to give a quick shout out to Fred over at Anthem Imports, who's been introducing me to a bunch of different places, but including Cape Byron. And so if you want to look up some really interesting brands coming into the US and elsewhere, Anthem Imports, just do a quick Google search, you'll be able to find them and see what brands they got. And with that, let's jump right in. So, Eddie, let's do the origin story for Cape Byron Distillery.
Yeah, so mate, we've got quite a tale of how I suppose we all came to be. Firstly, Australia in the world of whiskey and spirits, a lot of people forget, or Australia, you go, where the hell is that? Everyone looks to the map or starts spinning the globe around. But as a country, we're gaining a great reputation for spirits. But how the distillery came to be was really the chance meeting, the coming together with a legend in the world of Scotch whiskey called Jim McEwan. And this guy, whiskey drinkers listening to this, he was the master distiller of Bowmore, and then master distiller of Brookie, and creator of the Octomore gin, or Octomore whiskey, and the Botanist gin, and he's known as the bloody Bruce Springsteen of single malt whiskey, and just a legend. I'll tell you the story because I hope everyone's probably drinking a whiskey listening to this. That's the way it should be. But I was working for a spirit company in Australia, and at the time we had the opportunity, I was managing Brookie in Australia, and had the opportunity, Jim was coming over, and for me to put on a tour for the great Jim McEwan, I was just beside myself. Like, in the way I put it, imagine if you're a young boxer and you got to put on a tour for Muhammad Ali. That was kind of the level of, how much of an idol this man was to me. So I was just beside myself. And anyway, we did a 22-show sellout tour around the country, and 100 people packing into auditoriums and whiskey halls and listening to to Jim's stories of Isla and, these great old whiskey tales, and drinking the man's incredible single malt whiskies that he's created. And it was during that tour, Jim and I just formed a real friendship and a bond. And Jim is really, just such a family values and a values-driven man. He's always really about purpose more than anything. There's more than just the whiskey in the glass. There's the stuff behind it, the people, the place, the actual reason for it being. And I told him about my family and where we're from. So I'm situated in a little place called Byron Bay, On the very, very east, we are the most easterly part of Australia. For any listeners that have been to Australia, we're about 45 minutes south of the Gold Coast, so just on the New South Wales-Queensland border. And my family, for the last 35 odd years now, have passionately been regenerating rainforest on our farm. And we, the folks bought 96 acres of a rundown dairy farm, and it was complete desolate land. And, the family's life work has been regenerating rainforest. We grow macadamias as well. And it's now a thriving ecosystem. And, you could imagine it was me telling Jim about this, and we've just got such a love and a passion for the land. And we were just, the way I describe it, we were like two kids in a candy shop. Jim, the man of flavor and concept and ideals. And we just talked about this, and this idea really just sort of blossomed and bubbled to the top. And I remember on one part of the tour, we were traveling on the plane, and he turned to me, he said, "Eddie, I believe we were meant to meet, and we're going to start a distillery together." So that was in 2015. And then in 2016, we finished the distillery. We built it on farm, sits in the middle of our family farm and rainforest. So and we launched first our Brookie's gin, where we get to distill a lot of those native flavors and rainforest botanicals. We get to source, forage harvest straight from our rainforest. And that was the kind of the birth of the distillery. That's been and we've been sort of creating some incredible spirits. And now we've also just recently opened our whiskey chapter as well.
And absolutely. So Jim, I mean, if you're listening to the podcast, and this is going to be episode in high 100s, 110s, something like that, you've probably heard of Jim McEwan at this point. If not, I'd be really, really shocked. But true legend. I've never met him in person, but I've seen him speak a few times and been on a few tastings with him. And even after 50 plus years in the industry, still got such a passion for whatever he's talking about.
Yeah.
Doesn't hurt. He's also got his own private collection of Brookie bottles and barrels that come out once in a while that are some of the greatest scotches I've ever tried. So doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
But going back just slightly as you're touring him around, as you mentioned, you'd already been in the kind of spirits industry as an ambassador.
Yeah, definitely. So my background, so grew up on the family farm, and had a sort of a forced education. We call it putting kids to work, maybe child labor, whatever you want to call it. But that was an education in caring for the land, regenerating rainforest and farming, and also an immersion in food and flavor and balance. So I was always, from a young age, fascinated with food and flavor, and especially stuff that comes from the land. But yeah, my career was in the spirit industry. So I started as an ambassador. Cut my teeth more in the bar world, and this is winding the clock back a bit now. But in bars, and quite quickly found, a love for these great brands, and a sort of real interest about, well, where are these from? We're standing in a bar in Australia, tasting these single malt whiskies from these places in Scotland I've never heard of, and these incredible whiskies coming from, say, the States, all through the various bourbons we get, or tequila, these origin stories. And I was just fascinated by it. And I suppose growing up connected to land, that was quite easy for me to find that connection. So it was when I was an ambassador, I tell you what, it was some of the greatest years. I used to just get wheeled around, and my job was to get people to fall in love with the brands. And when you're working with products such as Brookie or the Botanist, I was lucky enough to look after the Buffalo Trace portfolio as well, and the Sazeracs, and educating Australian whiskey drinkers around bourbon. And with that, we had some incredible, quite alluring whiskies like the Pappy Van Winkles of the world as well. But yeah, that was sort of my career, and I've just loved educating people about the incredible world of spirits, how they're made. And then from that led me into sales and marketing, and worked with an importing and distributing company. And I suppose I was very fortunate to get a kind of a front row seat, or the best education ever, which was, how does the spirits game work, and how do we connect people to brands, but also how do we get people to really sort of, fall in love with what makes a great brand. And I think in this day and age, before, things were dreamt up around boardrooms, and you had to have this crazy great idea, and and then it was washed in this marketing, just to use the word, just bullshit. And Jim used to tell me these stories when he used to be a part of these brands, and he'd be sitting around boardroom tables, and they'd be saying, well, we're going to call it Glen McHaggis, and we're going to wrap it in a tartan, and we're going to say that it comes down from the hills of the Glens or whatever. And there's just so much kind of marketing sort of stories and tales got told, but it's the ones that had the true heart to them, the ones where you scratch the surface of the bottles and you see what stands up behind them. And those ones are just the ones you fall in love with and you come back to. And Brookie for me was that, it is the people's whiskey. It is, you look at how much of an impact that distillery has to their local community, how much of a hands-on approach it is, how much of a sort of very traditional approach it is to whiskey. And also the fact that it was a bit rogue, you kind of, you like to sort of, you get attracted to some of these sort of different approaches, and also, different styles, and sort of a bit of the underdog stories as well. So, I was very fortunate to have that career that, led me to, to meeting Jim, and now, I was very fortunate enough to be mentored by him, and, especially when creating our spirits, our Brookie's gin and our Cape Byron single malt whiskey. It was an incredible experience, and so he was just over last year where we launched the whiskey, but is also part owner in our business, which is very exciting.
Before, I guess while you were an ambassador, it sounds like you were saying you were already able to describe how spirits were made and the process. So certainly in theory, you had the knowledge down. When you realized that you wanted to start a distillery and start distilling for yourself, who taught you to make sure that the valves are on right and all these things? Was that also Jim, or did you have other influence as well?
that was Jim. With how much information's at our fingertips, and I used to educate people around the basics of distillation. And look, distillation is a basic sort of concept, and some basic practices around that. Obviously, when you're commercially distilling, there's a lot more finesse that goes into it along the way. Slight bit more, we like to keep it big picture and romantic before we get too bogged down in the detail. But my sort of, I did a fair bit of home distilling as well in the lead up to it. And for me, especially around, when we were starting the process of working out the recipe for our Brookie's dry gin, we were using a sort of plethora of native Australian botanicals, and some really incredible stuff. Some native finger lime, some native raspberry, white aspen. We've got cinnamon myrtle and aniseed myrtle and all these incredible flavors, but they'd never been distilled before. They'd been, you can taste them straight from the bush or straight from the land, but distillation and flavor that gets extracted through distillation and different types of distillation, creates very different flavors. So that was kind of a lot of the work I was doing in the background of it. But it was really my education when it came down to actual commercial distilling was from Jim. So we worked on the actual design of the still. So we had a great still maker in Tasmania. Who handmade a 2,000 litre copper pot still for us, a very traditional, classic Scottish pot still, beautiful long swan necks and on it. creating a really light, beautiful and delicate spirit. But running that still, this was how Jim used to run even the biggest stills at Brook or his time. It was all down to making sure from a distillation process that it's done by hand, it's done by touch, it's understanding how to train your senses, it's understanding how to train yourself from not needing the sort of incredible amount of science that we do have to sort of back us up on those a lot of distilleries will do that, but it's knowing when to make those cuts, knowing how hard to run your stills, and you can get completely different sort of spirit characteristics from just the way you run your stills through a spirit run. So very, very fortunate to not a bad teacher to have, I suppose, in the world of distilling.
No, not at all, for sure. And there are a couple follow questions to that, but I mean, this gin is dealing with some pretty strong flavors. You mentioned a couple of them already. So it's 25 botanicals, 17 of them are native. One of the ones I know that's not native, juniper. Australia, not good for juniper.
No.
But I mean, just going through again, you mentioned a few of them, but I want to reiterate a couple of these because I don't think I had a gin that had maybe more than one of these before, and it was probably aniseed and coriander I had, but things like cinnamon myrtle, finger and blood limes, the native rye berries, the white aspen, lily pilly, Dorgo pepper. I mean,
they almost sound like like made up names, right?
Exactly. And that's not even getting into the slow SLOW gin that has the Davidson tree plums in there. And these are flavors that outside of Australia, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe even outside of the region of Australia, the Northern Rivers that you're in, people aren't necessarily familiar with. So you talked about it a little bit just now and on Lush Life, but I'd love to just go a little more into when you were testing out each of these flavors and each of these botanicals, how you were figuring out which ones worked, which ones just didn't, and finding out how to meld these incredibly strong flavors together.
Yeah, it was a hell of a process, and when we looked to first create our Brookie's dry gin, we're very fortunate, obviously, with Jim and the work he did with creating the botanist gin. The man knows a thing or two about how to balance a great gin. So, we were very fortunate around that. We had such a great base of knowledge there to begin with. But he was using things that were foraged from, using botanists on Isla and, using bog myrtle and all these different weird and wacky stuff. But in Australia, and I'm a true believer of, spirits and food, but in particular gin, should really capture the place where it's from. We see these gins from all over the world and, from the far reaches, from Japan, and they've got the characteristics of Japan and all of this. And when you look at Australia and our food and drink sort of culture, we have the most incredible, rich culture from our indigenous history and our indigenous people of Australia. And these native foods have been part of our land for, hundreds of thousands of years. And they've developed through the uniqueness of our lands and of our rainforests. And Australia, as you may know, it's not a small place. So as you even just go up and down the east coast of Australia, you get these incredibly different climatic conditions. And where we are in Northern Rivers, to paint the picture, it's very much a subtropical region. We've got this huge belt of mountains behind us. We're quite coastal. We are coastal right there. But the temperatures have just sort of, it's one of the most densest subtropical regions and rainforest regions in Australia. And as a result of that, over hundreds of thousands of years, the plants that are, I suppose, endemic to that region, we have just such a rich sort of backyard, if you call it that, of these incredible flavors. So when we went out to craft this gin, we wanted it to really kind of capture that, and capture the uniqueness of these rainforest botanicals. But the kind of I think that the quality is in the subtlety as well. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of these big ones, and there's as many that we didn't use from trial that we didn't incorporate into the gin purely because they would have been too overpowering. So the first thing we did, actually, I'll tell you a little fun story. So, Jim arrived in Australia, and he'd been here a fair few times before with doing whiskey tours and whatnot. But he arrived and we kicked off, and Jim and I had already been on the phone, and every sort of second day we'd be talking through recipes, sending back and forth, and but day one was to immerse him into our world, and our world is a world of native botanicals. So my old man, Martin, his nickname's Brookie, where it came from. He is just beyond passionate about the rainforest. We call him the rainforest whisperer now. And one of Jim's nicknames is the cask whisperer. And he got that because he'd just be in the barrel halls of Brookie just talking to casks. He truly believes, he's so passionate about what he's doing, going, who's that bloke in the back chatting to all these casks? He's like, hey baby, how you doing? How's life treating you? How's the spirit going? And he just has such an incredible relationship with spirit. It transcends just making a product for Jim. But anyway, he arrived and we're bringing him into our world. So Dad, the rainforest whisperer, Jim and I, we headed deep into the rainforest, and we wanted to immerse Jim. Now, it was actually around September, and September for us is when we're coming into spring, and the rainforest is just teeming with life. And we got into this one part of the rainforest. We have native raspberries going, picking them off the tree. Jim, try this. We have native riberries growing, and these riberries taste like, kind of like a crisp watermelon, like an unripe watermelon. And then we had white aspen berries, and these things taste like lemon lime sorbet coming off the tree, the size of a pea and the shape of a pumpkin. And we had blossoming aniseed myrtle, the blossoms coming off these. And we were in this one area of probably 2 meter radius, and here we are having a feast. And then and then we've kept walking, and Dad was telling tales of talking about the rainforest, the birds, and the different species and whatnot. Now, there's an unwritten law when you're sort of eating bush foods in Australia, and generally, if it's a bright berry or if it's fruit, unless you know exactly what you're doing, you just don't eat the fruit. I think maybe that's hopefully a global thing. But anyway, we all kept walking, and Dad was talking away, and I was behind him and Jim behind us. And then after about 5 minutes, we turned around, and unbeknownst to us, Jim, along the whole way, anything that looked like a berry had been grabbing and bloody eating, and big, bark and bee. He was in his mind. He was thinking that absolutely everything was edible in the rainforest. And fortunate enough, he only got an upset tummy. You could imagine the headlines on Islay, the Pope of Islay, poisoned by bloody Byron Bay gin makers. But, going back, is that immersion into native flavors. And it's really the way I think a good way to talk about it is, it's about balance. And Jim talks about it, good way, paint it in your mind's eye. It's like an orchestra, or let's use the analogy. It's like a painting, right? You've got your backdrop, and your backdrop is your clean, clear spirit and your water. And we use a very pure Mount Warning spring water. Then you've got your main core botanicals, and those will create the bigger bulk of the picture. Your juniper berries, your coriander seed, you're going to have your classic citrus in there, some angelica and some cinnamon, and those are your kind of more traditional. But the nuance and the beauty comes from those brushstrokes. And that's where, interlacing and balancing in all of our native botanicals. And that's what creates such a beautiful piece in there. So that's where all the interest is. And I can tell you right now, if you're smelling it and tasting it, you're never going to really probably find that one key flavor that's going to come out. You might get a note of it, but that's kind of what we want. It's the sum of all parts when those botanicals all distill together, and they create something really quite special into a beautiful balanced gin. But took us quite a while to to get that spirit right. And I remember the first time when we ran the still. Every time a still runs and a new spirit is born, it's always such a poignant moment in the distillery's life. And the night we did our first distillation, it was just Jim and I and the family, and we were distilling late at night. We will we'd put the still on the day before. We got a hot steep everything. All of our botanicals go into our still, and then we hang all of our native fruits and delicate native botanicals in what we call Babylon bags. And Jim came up with this after he's an ideas man, and he had this concept, because if we put these soft, delicate flavors in the belly of the still, you can kind of think about it. It's a pretty brutal environment. It's boiling away in there, and they'll just get lost. All that nuance and delicate notes that we're looking for will just get lost. So he had this idea, and he said, Eddie, we're going to create Babylon bags. I'm like, Jim, talk to me. What the hell are you talking about here, man? And he said, put this in your thought. The hanging gardens of Babylon. Gardens attached and these mists and vapors passing through it. That's what we're going to create in the still. So all of that went in, and then we started running the still late into the night, and all of that work that's gone into it, and you don't really know until you push go. And this is a 2,000 litre still. That's a lot of cost and a lot of ingredients that have gone into it, and also the weight of, hey, have we actually got a great spirit, or and there was just silence, and the spirit was running, and it was completely cloudy. And even this green tinge to it at the start. And we were looking, I remember Jim and I shot each other a look, and I was looking at him and like thinking, geez, what's happening here? And we just kept running the spirit. And it was about I think it was about 35 minutes into the run. And, you keep adding water and you're checking it. And this beautiful clean note. What we find when we make our gin cut is we just get this explosion of fruit, this incredible aroma, almost like candied, sort of candied raspberries and candied orange and beautiful aniseed coming through. And the way Jim describes it, what you're looking for from your nose is, it's like your nose can see where the clouds part on a rainy day and the sun comes through. Those big, beautiful, clear notes will punch through. And that was the birth of Brookie. Back in when was that? October 2016 was the birth date of our dear Brookies. And we've been distilling and sharing and drinking ever since.
It's worth noticing. Yeah, those Babylon bags, I'd never heard of them before. So clearly, well, before doing some research for this episode, and you could see them if you're listening and you go to the Cape Byron Distillery website. As part of the About Us video, you see them. They're not called out as Babylon bags, I think, but when you see the kind of white mesh bags that the fruits are being poured into, those are those Babylon bags. And I found it super interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, your still, he said somewhere else, it was designed by a German madman on Tasmania. So it's as I said, it's fairly Scotch style. It's got the basic pot still, neck, line arm, but it's got a few oddities too. The line arm is broken up by a gin basket, or a space where you could put a gin basket, I should say. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was from the beginning of this distillery, the whiskey was kind of secondary. It wasn't part of the original thought. And again, listeners, I promise we will get to whiskey. I know I've been remiss in the past few episodes, I promise. But I think of a gin still is usually either, it could be pot or column or a hybrid, but it's generally like a high neck. You're trying to get a very clean, neutral spirit, if you will, at the end of it. But instead, this kind of went backwards, where it's using a Scotch style whiskey style still in order to make a gin with a slightly declining but almost even line arm and this 2,000 liter pot. So I guess, what kind of base spirit, just as a flavor profile or as a texture profile, were you going for? Because I imagine it wasn't kind of a neutral grain spirit if you're using that kind of a still.
Yeah, definitely. It was. It's funny. I always get asked the question, and here I'm sitting here with our whiskey today. Oh, we did. You was always gin first, and then you were getting straight to whiskey, right? And when we first launched, and when we first started the distillery, there was conversation of whiskey, but it wasn't in our direct plan. We were our goal was really crafting spirits that represented our sort of backyard and our region, and showcased our rainforest. And gin is the perfect vehicle for that. And also then the other spirits and, liqueurs and, infused gins that we can do and variants of that. So, we had, talk about, having these sort of shelves and a few light bulbs sitting up there. And, that was a light bulb on a shelf, but it wasn't actually in our immediate plans for making whiskey. But for us, when it comes to, when we were talking, having the conversations about the styles of spirit, but also the styles of stills to use, it was always around a really traditional Scottish pot still. And for one simple reason, pot stills are all about flavor. You mentioned it before, if you're running different columns or different rectifiers on stills, you're going to get higher grade spirits. You can potentially get distillation off at drawing out at higher ABVs and, refined cuts, and those really probably a lot more delicate notes. And, and that's great. Don't get me wrong, but that's not the style of spirit we were wanting to make. And there's nowhere to hide in a pot still. I want to make it that clear. When you're doing a single shot, gin distillation, that is one of the bloody hardest things to get right. When you think about it, you can do different forms of gins. If we took, 25 botanicals and distilled them all just separately and then, kind of balance them out from there, that's fine. That's one way of doing it. But gin, you've got to have all of those sort of flavors balanced in there together. But for us, the spirit was always about maximizing flavor. So, when we look to, the spirit, gin itself is, you're starting with something that's neutral in terms of, essentially you're starting with vodka. You want to have the most clean, pure, spirit, neutral alcohol that you can, and for us, we're very fortunate. We work with a great producer in Australia that creates a wheat spirit for us. And it is just incredible. Like, we could bottle it up and sell it and bloody win awards just for vodka, but that sort of goes against a lot of our kind of principles on that. But it's just so clean. It's got a sweetness to it, an underlying sweetness as well. So for us, for gin, it's perfect. This single shot distillation. We use a few infusion methods. So we have. We put all of our kind of what we refer to as our harder botanicals, more traditional, the ones that need to get woken up. Your juniper berries, they're all dried. Your coriander seeds, they're dried. So what we do, we load those in the day before, and you build this raft. You almost build it so they float on top of each other. And then what we do is we come in and we heat up the still. And it's a very, very technical temperature that we heat it up to, just till it's too hot to touch, is the technical definition, around 60 degrees. And what you'll do there is then we turn the still off and we close it down. All the hatches are down. And what that does, we leave that for around about 17 hours. And in that process, those dried juniper berries, cinnamon quills, all of those coriander seeds, what they'll do is they'll swell up and they'll pop and they'll release all of their flavor. At the end of the day, we're trying to extract as much flavor out of these botanicals and maximize them, getting it all into the spirit. Then day two, comes the addition of our Babylon bags and also our native ginger into the line arm, into our botanical basket. Now, a day of distillation for gin, it's they're my favorite days. So we actually do a first morning harvest at when the sun's coming up for one of our particular botanicals, which is called a bottle brush. And it's actually on a $5 note of our Australian currency. But this is this incredible red flowering leaf. And the reason for it is the Indigenous used to make a cordial from it. So they'd pick it, but they'd always choose it. You pick it first thing in the morning when it's soaked in nectar and honey and its own dew, and you'd soak it in water. But what we do is we go out first thing as the sun's breaking, when it's just soaked in that morning nectar. So that's when the flavor is at its optimal. And we pick and harvest all of that. We balance in and add into all of our softer, delicate native botanicals into our Babylon bags. Those bags are hung from hooks we've welded on the inside of our pot still, so they're suspended. And then we have the native ginger stems, which is like a really mild lemongrass, into the basket. So 3 different points of infusion, and then the beauty and the magic of distillation happens, and that's where all of those 25 botanicals distill together, and you get this beautiful rainbow and cascading of flavors from the whole way through, from the start of your heart's cut towards the end of your heart's cut. For us, the 4 shots and the feints, the heads and tails, we don't reuse those for when we make gin. And there's nothing really, because we've got pure spirit, we're not getting any you're not sort of getting any real sort of methanols or anything coming off those, but what you're getting is undesirable flavor. So your spirit has to be balanced. So, we'll run our 4 shots off for a while, and then it's about capturing that heart, always based on the sensory cut. And then likewise, at the start of the run, it's beautiful and vibrant and beautiful, a huge amount of fruit and top notes to our gin. You'll be getting those sort of candied citrus and juniper and whatnot, and you'll get this burst of macadamia coming through, beautiful piney note of citrus. And then towards the end of the run, you've got a lot more earthy, woody characteristics. That angelica and that cinnamon will be showing its head, and a bit more of that aniseed, or a bit more of that cinnamon myrtle and dorigo pepper leaf. But you combine those all together, and that's your middle cut, and it's just just a beautiful, sweet, and incredibly delicate and balanced spirit. But it's something you can go back to time and time again. We talk about it that we didn't want to make an interesting gin; we wanted to make a great gin. I've got a lot of interesting bottles. I don't drink them all the time. It's the great ones that I go, you know what? I want to make this into a gin and tonic, a martini, a variety of different cocktails for it to work in.
And I've kind of got the same thing. And you mentioned it earlier. I think it's worth restating that my favorite gins, and it sounds like yours too, are those really the ones that showcase the place that they come from. I think of, besides the Brookies, of course, you mentioned a Japanese gin, so I think of Roku with 6 botanicals in there, very basic, with like the juniper, lemongrass, shiso leaf. That very basic stuff. It's a very light, clean gin. It's works well for sipping. I would say I would use it more in a kind of Asian Negroni, probably. But so I love my Negronis. But even with ones around the US and around different areas of England, Scotland, and the ones that really use the native botanicals are the best. I get it. It's gin. You have to use juniper. To call it a gin, you have to use juniper. And you're probably going to use some of the coriander, the angelica root, some, things like that. But there's such a wide world out there. And I think it's an extreme example. The Brookies is an extreme example because it's using so many things that nobody else is using. But it's a great example, therefore, of how gin can really represent, perhaps more than any other spirit, the botanicals and the native landscape from which they come, and makes it fun to explore.
Oh, that's it. And that, like, when people are trying a say in the States, hey, enjoying a Brookies, or, in the UK, or wherever they are around the world, you want them to be captured and taken back to that place,
Mhm.
and for us, it's that capturing that the rainforest, and how do we bring that into it, and you want to have those incredible flavors and those incredible native rainforest botanicals coming through and shining through, but in a way that's enjoyable, not in a way that's like slaps you around the head, from a flavor profile. Yeah, I just enthralled with the world of gin, and the global world of gin, and my favorites are the ones that really do showcase where they're from. That have a sense of place, have a sense of of uniqueness, and showcasing where they're from. And yeah, from Japan, Australia, we've got so many great ones, and yeah, all throughout, and that's where the difference and the nuance comes from. But again, you can have, there's that interesting, and then there's good. You can taste something and you go, oh wow, I can definitely taste that. But is that a good taste? That's the distiller's job, is to make sure that those incredible flavors and unique flavors that are used are balanced, and they're great. And a lot of time less is more. Versus, you're going to have, if you've got two or three or four really massive, big opposing flavors all fighting for sort of front of mouth, if you will. You get some pretty perplexing kind of mouth feels and drinking experiences. So, we like to sort of really, really make sure that all of our spirits have that sense of balance, and yeah, and sort of beauty to them as well.
All right. And with that, the moment maybe half the audience has been waiting for. I really hope you didn't skip the episode first half on gin, because I'm telling you, that's a next new world to explore. But we are going to go into the whiskeys now from Cape Byron. So from the beginning, like I said, whiskey, despite Jim McEwan's involvement, whiskey was not the first thing to be created. There was gin first, with whiskey as a maybe idea on the shelf, but it was gin first. What was that moment, if you remember, that you decided, you know what, I want to go into the whiskey as well?
Yeah, it was funny, being in the role that I was, and obviously where Jim and I came together, and what Jim is most renowned for is his work in whiskey. But I think when you sort of overlay and get to understand what our family's passion is it's about sort of giving back to the land. It's about regenerating rainforests, and how can that spirit and the things that we create have a great impact on that, and build a bit of voice and legacy for creating that. And I suppose that's the reason why Jim was so enthralled with this concept, and now we all get to work together. And yeah, they're a hoot when they get together. Jim and Barbara and the folks, it's they're bloody danger. But yeah, but it's not to say we didn't have the idea of whiskey. We definitely talked about it, and I talk about it. Having these light bulbs on shelves, and you have these ideas, right? A lot of times you go back to them, and you might dust them off and bring them up in conversation. And Jim and I, like when the first idea of the distillery came together, we just can't help it. So Jim and I would be on the phone, and and on calls pretty regularly, and he's fascinated. Hey, how's things at the distillery going, and the team and the spirits running, and and then we'd just be talking about different flavors. Jim is an ideas man, and we just love throwing things up at the wall. So we didn't start distilling our first whiskey, never made our first spirit until 2019. So, from concept from 2015, there's obviously quite a gap. And how it happened, it was sort of, it was almost so similar to how the first idea naturally bubbled up. And it's sometimes when ideas are too good not to do, there's just, it naturally has a way that leads itself to coming to life. And that was through conversations and Jim and I over time. And, we challenge ourselves and we talk about really coming down to imagine what the hell it would be like making a single malt whiskey in Byron Bay, in a very hot subtropical climate. We pretty much get, I'm in winter here, and sitting here in t-shirt and shorts at 11 p.m. at night. We do get a winter, but not so much. And, we chat about, and I was always fascinated about picking Jim's brain because, I talk about spirit and sense of place. I love Islay single malt whiskies and really true Islay single malt whiskies that are also aged on Islay, and you can taste it. You can taste that salinity. There's this additional character that's to it, and I think that's such a stamp on what a great Islay, single malt should be. And we talk about it. Well, how would that rainforest climatic situation influence it? And we're right by the ocean as well. How is that sort of, kind of that coastal influence going to affect our whiskey? And what the hell would an Australian single malt whiskey taste like? And we talked about a lot of Australian whiskies and stuff, and we just talk about it, right? And then it got to a point where this idea we knew was too good not to bring to life. And it really comes down to the concept here of our temperature and the unique climate environment that we have in Australia. Jim's world has been the world of Scotch single malt whiskey, and understanding that maturation from that side of things. And I can tell you, even in the winter months in Scotland, there's cold, and then there's winter months in Scotland cold, and just that how long things take to age, but that's just the nature of what the Scotch industry is, and we're very fortunate. I had a bit of a concept of we're by no means the first Australian whiskey. We get to sort of walk from a path trodden by some great distilleries. Up and running, and like the likes of Sullivan's Cove, the Starwoods of the world, and so we get to tap in and get an idea. Well, we know in Australia we've got a faster maturation, but there's no whiskey that's getting matured in our really unique climatic situation. And that was kind of the idea that set it off. We grow incredible barley in Australia. We're known for being, as farmers, we grow a lot of grain. And yeah, the idea was too good, really. So, as two kids chatting about great ideas, it happened. This idea was there, and so we set the wheels into motion. We had the still, we had our still there, and it was a classic Scottish pot still, great for gin. Don't get me wrong, but also perfect for whiskey. So we started the process in Australia. Our laws around, whiskey making are quite different. They're different all over the world. And one of those is you don't have to produce your wort or wash on site. And literally a stone's throw from our distillery is one of Australia's best craft beers, which is called Stone and Wood. And we knew the founders, and these guys have just made the most incredible beer. And it was a great partnership. So we were able to partner with Australia's kind of leading craft beer makers, and we worked on, got to work on well, what's the structure and the malt build going to be, and the mash build here, and the yeast structures. We knew this type of spirit we wanted to create, and that was, we didn't want it to be a Scotch. We didn't want it to be anything other than what an Australian single malt is. But, with Jim, when we're talking, and especially from, when I was asking Jim, right, well, what's the type of spirit we want to create? And it's all about elegance. You want to have this beautiful, delicate spirit. You want to have this classic, beautiful, elegant fruit characters coming through. Your lychee, kiwi, peach, and pear, beautiful malt characteristics. You don't want it too sweet. You don't want it too overpowering. And so we knew that was kind of the flavor profile we were looking at. And so we worked on a bunch of running different yeast trials, and we settled on 2 different yeast strains for our wash. And a sort of pretty classic times on a fermentation, about a sort of 72-hour fermentation, using Australian unpeated barley. And the spirit is just sensational. We have everything we set out to achieve, the beautiful delicateness to our spirit. It's elegant. It's got this beautiful sweetness to the spirit. Great malt profile to there as well, and that beautiful cereal note. But you're going to get these almost underlying tones of kind of tropical character. And when you think subtropical in Australia, it just makes sense. We've got that lychee, these sort of tinned peaches, tinned pears in syrup, and this classic. There's a fruit called a custard apple. I don't know if you ever tried one. It's almost like a prickly pear, sort of maybe as a note to kind of reminisce to. But that was where we worked on our spirit. And in 2019. We did a lot of trials, and Jim came back over, and then we set the wheels into motion. And he was here for a while, and we got the spirit right, and got things running well. And again there was a moment where a new child was born, and a new spirit was made, and that first time. I can tell you, for any whiskey lovers or any spirit lovers, if there's a time in your life, if you have an opportunity to be in a still room when a first cut gets made in a heart run of a new spirit, it's a beautiful, beautiful moment. And our Cape Byron whiskey Cape Byron spirit was created, and it is just sensational. It's so good. You could drink the new make on its own. But that's kind of what highlights and is the backbone to our spirit, to our whiskey, which is this beautiful elegance to our whiskey. And I think, especially in Australia, our wood profile that we use all ex-bourbon casks, so imported from the States, especially for the original. And our spirit was crafted to balance in for that, using ex-bourbon, because what we have is a climate that promotes rapid aging. Now, to put this in perspective, I sent samples over to Jim of the final blend that was only, 5 barrels we were batting together for our first release. It was about 1,200 units, and sent him a bunch of samples, and we got on the phone, and straight away he said, "Eddie, I've got the sample. It's great, but you're pulling my leg. Like, you're taking me for a ride here, Eddie. Like, you've written 3.5 years on it. What the hell? It's not, that's the same flavor profile that he sees from whiskeys he's been creating on Isla of around a 7-year-old, 6-7-year-old whiskey. So we're getting a much, much quicker maturation. So for us, we're conscious of that and always have been. So our warehouses, because we're in such a warm climate, our aim is to not temperature control. We just want to take the heat curve out of summer, is what we tend to do. So we have we created these rainforest whiskey warehouses, really thick eco insulation. And the goal there is essentially we're on the days where it's reaching 30, 32 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm terrible with this. It's hot, I'll tell you that. Instead of it being at that 30 degree, it's going to be at 24, 25. So your whiskey is not extracting too much. When you get too much extraction, you're going to get a lot of tannin. And what that comes through in your whiskey is a lot of bitterness and unbalance. Good things take time. You've got to extract that at the right rate. And we get great levels of extraction, but really, really good timing in our maturation as well. So, we think it's a pretty special climate, and that we talk about it. It's where the rainforest meets the sea, and you can sort of picture that, and you close your eyes when you're having your nose and having a sip, and hopefully that'll take you there. If not, you can imagine you're standing in a rainforest drinking a whiskey. It's a beautiful place to be. It's crafted a pretty special whiskey that we're pretty proud of, and and people are enjoying, which is the main thing.
This month's Impact Spotlight is on White Heather and McNair's blended whiskies, and the tales of the two men who made these venerable brands what they are. The first is Billy Walker, a 2021 Icons of Whiskey Hall of Fame inductee and owner of the Glenallachie, another Impex brand and a recent podcast guest. Billy has over 5 decades of experience in the Scotch world. With White Heather unshow-filtered blended whiskey, Billy returns to his roots. White Heather was relaunched in 2021 with a 21-year-old blended Scotch, and is now joined by a 15-year-old edition. Both feature 47% single malt in their blend and draw from top stocks in Islay, Speyside, and the Highlands. The 15-year-old is matured in American and Spanish oak casks for a beautiful blend of honey, malt, wispy smoke, and candied citrus. The 21-year-old is matured in American oak and sherry butts for 18 years, before a final 3 years in PX and Oloroso puncheons. This is plus time in medium toast and medium char Appalachian oak for a final burst of sweetness and complexity. The second story is of Harvey McNair. McNair was the essence of a Victorian Scotsman. He accomplished many trades and travels in his lifetime, and more than anything, he loved and championed the natural, unadulterated color of whiskey. Pure gold, as he called it. Pure gold was the foundation of the whiskey blends he created. Today's McNair unshow-filtered blended whiskey, thanks to Billy Walker, honors Harvey's legacy, marrying peated malt, Highland, Islay, and Speyside with Glenallachie spirit. This is a blend for the peat lovers. To find all of these whiskeys and any Impex product, visit a premium spirits retailer near you. You can also visit Impex at www.impexbev.com or email office@impexbev.com for those harder to find releases. The Whiskey Ring podcast is proudly sponsored by Impex Beverages.
And I've thankfully gotten to try a sample of that, and as I said, I really enjoyed it. The notes are spot on. It's got a creaminess to it, a heft that doesn't take away from the lightness of the spirit. I think it's more that it's a light spirit. It's delicate, elegant, but also has enough of a mouthfeel that it's not effervescent. It just doesn't disappear. You really do get to enjoy it. And for the kind of coastal and rainforest in the middle, there's, for me at least, just that minor bit of salinity in there that I tend to enjoy. Yeah. It's not like someone's pouring salt into the whiskey or anything like that. It's not even seawater. It's nothing like that. It's but for an example, you mentioned that on Islay you prefer Islay whiskeys that are aged on Islay, which is something worth noting, just because I think there's a perception that if something says an Islay whiskey, that it's that all of them are aged on Islay, which is not true. Islay is kind of it's the same, but the opposite direction of what you're seeing, where it's facing the west. It's getting all those winds off the North Atlantic, hence a lot of the marine notes, salinity in the peat that they use, and every distillery I think has at least one warehouse that's on the island, and that's where you get the pictures of like the Lagavulin and the Ardbeg, the Lefroy, gets those white buildings on the coast and all that, which is great. And without calling out any particular distillery, because I don't know off the top of my head which ones do and which ones don't, most of the aging is not done on Islay. It's done on the mainland. And a lot of that is simply for practical purposes. There's just not enough room. There's not enough people. There's only 3,000 people on the entire island. There's a lot more sheep than there are people. And there's not a lot of, industrial roads and trucks. And so it's just more practical, which is fine to a point. It's fine to the point at which you should really say it's not. If I taste an Islay whiskey and I'm expecting that note, whether it's peated or unpeated, I'm still expecting that sea air note. And if I don't get it, I kind of have a feeling it wasn't aged on the island. But
you get that for me is, and again, I go back to, and something we're really proud of, which is that, you scratch the surface, scratch the sticker, and what's beneath it, And we're a big believer in true transparency, and that's actually, sustainability and transparency is such a big part of what we do. And we're actually certified as a B Corp business now, a distillery, and really about that is about your impact on kind of just how you run your business, as a business, as a force for good, but also without the bullshit. That's a good way to put it. But you get, Brookie, two of my ones who are talking about really classic true islas. And look, actually, I hate to use that term because it's not. We're just talking about whiskies that we know are aged there. And, Kilchoman and Brookie are those two. You've got a lot of the other distilleries. Yes, absolutely. You just don't know if it's all there. But Brookie, there's just so many incredible sort of whiskies. But I even just love the sort of, even some of their first releases, like if you get just an Isla barley, when it's even like forget the releases of what they were, just a classic unpeated Isla barley. There's such a creaminess to that spirit, and there's a delicateness, but that character of that salinity for me is just such a beautiful thing in a whiskey. And I like to talk, and we talk a lot about it, which is character. We want character in our whiskey. We don't want character that's a bad character. We want that stuff that makes our whiskey unique and puts our stamp on it. And, you walk into our barrel houses and the hoops are rusting off. If you're a kid, like me, when I was growing up here, you ride your bike around, you're going to have a rusty chain on your bike. It's just a given, because we've got so much rich salt in the air. And that works its way through to the cask. It does. It takes time, and the levels it comes through are different. But you will find those sort of subtle notes, and that's like you were mentioning and describing. It's not a saltiness. It's not you're not going to taste. People aren't going to taste seawater in a whiskey, and you look for it, but there is this very mild, just a little note of it on the palate, and it's a beautiful, beautiful flavor.
Besides, Isla in particular, or what Jim had done at Brookie or Bowmore, I heard another interview that your mom was a Scotch fan as well.
She doesn't mind a whiskey or two, the old girl.
Yeah. So, of course, Jim had a massive impact on the style of spirit. You also spoke to a couple of the other Australian brands that had their own style as well. When you and Jim were thinking about the style, did you have any particular ones that you really said, this is another one that I really like, that maybe had nothing to do with Jim, but it was like, that's a whiskey I really admire, or I like how it came out, that you could look to as inspiration?
Yeah, I think it's definitely styles, and it's really interesting to see what different styles are getting produced. And for me, I really enjoy Japanese style whiskies, and I think you can taste a lot of their approach and their cultural approach in that whiskey. There's such delicate notes to their spirit. It's very clean. And for me, I've always been a fan of more clean whiskies, not huge, massive sort of oak characteristics. And a lot of time is to actually, there's such beauty in the spirit itself. And my favorite whiskies are when the spirit shines through, rather than being overly dominated by the oak that it's in. And those, the perfect whiskies that I have in my mind are the ones that have that balance of spirit and oak, rather than just tasting the oak of where it's from. But yeah, I think I just drew so much inspiration, I think, from Jim's work that he did at Brookie at the time. You look at even some of those earlier releases of still today, one of my favorite whiskies that's ever been produced there is just the classic Laddie. It's just such an incredibly well-structured single malt whiskey. The weight of the spirit. A lot of people, we don't talk about, I think, the weight of the spirit, or a lot of people don't really understand that, but it's, it's the texture of the whiskey. And for us, and you picked up on it, which is brilliant, we have this beautiful kind of oily, viscous, luscious texture to our whiskey. When you, as you sip it, it'll coat your mouth, and that's all the oils coming through from the barley, really low and slow distillation or slow distillation, and beautiful spirit, and that's, and for us, you'll see on our bottles, and we do not chill filter. We're at a higher ABV at that 47%. So that's generally, if you see whiskies around 46 and above, you're not going to see chill filtration used, and we don't add any color to our whiskey as well. Because the whiskey's so good as it is, we work so hard to get all that sort of character into it. But for me, it's about those whiskies that really, again, it's probably actually similar probably to how it's just brought up. And, I love products that really show you can taste where it's from. What's the uniqueness, the character of that place and that space of how it's coming into it. And I think that's kind of really what led me why I was so enthralled with these different whiskies that Jim was producing. But I love it when you can taste a good Japanese single malt and you can taste the uniqueness to it, or the different regions of Scotland. You can taste between a Highland, a Lowland, a Speyside, and those ones that really kind of embody those. Even in Australia now, we're such a young, we've only been making whiskey here in Australia for 30 years. We actually have rolled the clock back. We do have, we used to make a lot more whiskey here in Australia, bigger distilleries and closed down. But the craft whiskey movement's only about 30 odd years old. Started, Bill Lark was, kind of referred to him as the godfather of Australian single malt whiskey, and really started it. And now we've got, in Australia, we've got about 500 distilleries. A lot of those are just making gin, and would be about 250 to 300 whiskey distilleries now in Australia. And the opportunity of different sort of nuance and flavor profiles. But we wanted to take the best of kind of classic traditional methods and stuff that you just don't mess with, but then also overlaying it with, our world and which is our landscape. And we've taken that best of really classic traditional spirit and distillation techniques. And, I talk about this with our distilling team and we don't take it lightly. We had a hell of a baton passed on to us from Jim. And, that baton was, the kind of the passion and the heart of making and crafting incredible single malt whiskey. And you don't stuff around with that. You've got to put everything you've got into it to make sure that spirit is incredible. Every time you're running the stills, you're pitching the yeast, you're blending in, we're making incredible spirit here. We're so fortunate we get to do that. But it's ensuring that spirit really does capture the place where we're from. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I wafted around in there.
No, it did for sure. And just going back, I just want to jump back to something you said earlier. For reference, so you said just now that Australia, you got 250 to 300 distilleries. Size wise, if you take away Alaska, Australia is about the same size as the continental US. I think it's very, very slightly smaller, but it's comparably size. So the only reason the United States is ranked one step above is because of Alaska. So, take that for what it's worth. But if you
mind you've got a few more people than Australia. I think we're about 28 million population. Few more in the US.
Few more. I think we've got about that in New York, to be honest. But it's so slightly different, of course. But you've got a large area in the center of the country that it's mainly desert or different tundras that it's just harder to live in. It's just like we have New Mexico or Arizona, parts of that where it's just not feasible for people to live. So the concentration is understandably more around the coastline, all around. But the way that I was thinking about that too is just as a comparison, you've got 30 years of the craft whiskey movement in Australia. You're already up to 250, 300 distilleries. That's still an amazing number for 28 million people, mainly living not in the center of the country, mainly around the coast and in the cities and areas surrounding them. And Of course, as we know, the vast majority of those whiskeys and those companies have not made it outside of Australia, outside of the kind of global south. Maybe a few have made it to the main houses in London, but particularly from a US standpoint, a lot of them are unknown still in the US. And until recently, that went for Cape Byron as well. So so I guess the starter question for this is, what does the local market look like for you in the Australian market that you're trying to capture with Cape Byron?
Yeah, we love a drink here in Australia. So all of those distilleries are just servicing thirsty mouths. No, it has been a boom, and I think there's been globally a boom of craft distilling. Look, when we use those about 500, licenses now that are operating, so many of those are kind of 1-2 person, what we call, reference sort of mum and pop, pop sort of distilleries, and that's such a great thing. Like in Australia, we're got such beautiful landscapes and such broad land and different areas, and all these small, tiny little distilleries are popping up. So if you're going for a holiday here, there might be 2 or 3 micro distilleries and a few breweries, and we were renowned in Australia. We've got a great industry, a wine industry, and we're quite internationally renowned for the quality that we produce. Beer has been one. We make great beer as well. But spirits, the craft spirits movement, I use the term 30 years. When we started in 2016, we were only about there was only about 100 distilleries operating. And when I'm saying 100, there was probably only about 15 more, really, that were giving it a crack and operating. So it's been growing. There's definitely a lot more competition that's happening in Australia, but to the consumer, they get to taste all of these incredible spirits that capture all these different micro regions. And as consumers now, what's great is more people are getting educated about spirit and craft spirit, and this movement toward more producers, more suppliers, is people get educated about what is great spirits, or what spirits are. We're taking wine drinkers, beer drinkers, and educating them about, hey, if you haven't tried whiskey or gin, well, people have these these sort of concepts about why they don't like it. Oh no, that's a grandma's drink, or a lot of time it's your tonic you're drinking with it, not necessarily the gin itself. And so it's just been definitely a boom. It is getting more competitive, but what we're doing is we're not competing against each other. I think of Australian spirits that are now consumed is only about 6%, I think, of the spirit. So that puts it in perspective. The biggest one we go up against is the imported spirits. And, there's a lot of those, obviously, we can't produce here ourselves. Tequila is a great example. Bourbon is an even better example. But more people are getting educated about spirits, and they will continue to turn to, there's a global movement about locality and people turning and enjoying products made locally. And it's a great thing. And we're pretty excited to be a part of that, but also to kind of, we get to bring a lot of sort of young distilleries and people that are starting through, and especially from our sustainability practices as a distillery, we open our doors and we want to bring as many people through and educate as many people about, what not to do from all the things that we've done and done them 3 times over, and, how to manage waste and how to be as, kind of sustainably minded and looking at your energy usage. And it's a very inclusive and welcoming industry once when you're in there. I think the fact that we all make alcohol also helps.
Definitely. I mean, there are many worse ways to spend your day than making and trying alcohol for sure.
Yeah.
So that's the Australian market. As you expand and become one of those distilleries from Australia that get to go global, what have been kind of the let's say the low hanging fruit, and what have been some of the challenges in going global?
Yeah, the biggest thing is, does your brand, do we have a purpose and a reason to actually exist in these markets? And those are the questions that we ask ourselves. And that was probably the biggest ones going into the States. We truly believe that we've got a really incredible, spirit, but also, a reason for being, and that we would like to think that customers might resonate to our spirit about, geez, the uniqueness, Australian rainforest botanicals. Hey, and I didn't even know Australia had rainforest, let alone botanicals. You make a gin from it, and a proposition of Australian whiskey. Like, that is such a new world concept. And for whiskey drinkers, that's a pretty exciting thing. So I suppose that those are the questions that we really ask ourselves, and to be honest, still asking ourselves, and then going, well, how do we make sure that we connect with those customers that are interested, or and that's all coming down to education, and it's been great so far. So for us, we're selling to about sort of, how are we, about 10 different countries, or 10 to 12 different countries now. In England, in Germany. A lot through Southeast Asia and different Asian countries as well. We're launching in the US around 6 months ago. So the launch, we always had an eye on the States. It was just making sure that we had firstly found a right partner, and in Anthem Imports and Spirits, we found that, and because we wanted to find partners that really, really believed in great spirits and great brands, that are after things that aren't just unique, but or also that they know will kind of resonate to customers and drinkers. And so for us, our job now is to connect people to our Brookie's gin and to our Cape Byron single malt whiskey. And we think that, hopefully there's a bit of an intrigue there, because the spirit's sensational, and we've got the awards and accolades to show that. Our gin has been picked up now a trophy cabinet full of golds and double golds at World San Francisco, and our whiskey that's only been out for less than a year is picked up 90. Actually, only just the other day, we were talking before, it's won best in class at the SIP Awards, and also 95 points and best in class at the USA Spirits just the other week. So it's incredible to get those accolades, because geez, we work so hard to that. And when you make such a good thing, that means nothing unless the people drinking it enjoy it. To have those sort of for that to be tried and sort of put under scrutiny, and people enjoying the spirits always helps when we're going in, especially when we're venturing into new markets. And the States has definitely been on our mind for some time. In the incredible whiskey market, and there's so much interest in New World whiskies, and different whiskies, in particular in the single malt world, and also in the gin category too. Of New World gins, and this exploration and trial, and finding these new spirits. And hopefully we'll find a fair few people that might enjoy a drop or two of our Brookies and Cape Byron.
Sure. And one quick technical question that I forgot to ask earlier, when you're talking about your wort and the mash, are you using a clear or cloudy wort?
Cloudy.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
It can go either way in Scotland, so
yeah. No. For us, it's all about the character and the flavor. So it's a little bit different because we don't produce it on site ourselves, and look, that's it's a positive, but also creates challenges, and we're really fortunate with the distance and location. So it'll be produced and coming out of the mash tun at about 10 a.m. It'll be at the distillery by in 3 hours later. All unfermented, and such minimal time and in vessels, so we're not getting any sort of any natural yeast or any sort of bacteria growth growing in there. And then we can also, and we do a really fast, rapid fermentation, but we're able to control the hotter temperature spikes for fermentation. Again, the only thing we're concerned about is in summer. Winter for us, again, we barely have one. And I think I remember when I've never been to a lot of bourbon distilleries. It's actually, kicking myself. That's on the list, but I know that a lot of bourbon distilleries will actually temperature control warehouses in winter to make sure that there's year-long maturation, because when barrels drop below 7 degrees, they're Celsius, they're essentially, or when they're getting cold, they lie dormant. And as distillers, and as distilleries, we want our whiskey to be kissing that oak and making beautiful whiskey all year long, but making sure it's not happening too quick. So, the temperature for us has just been, it's been really interesting. Like we, a bit of a nerdy thing, but we love it. So we have these temperature maps all throughout our warehouses and distilleries. We essentially put temperature probes all through. And we get to track it where are those fluctuations, and you have these concepts here of where we think those temperatures will go, and keeping consistent, because you don't want it with temperature, you don't want it too consistent. If it's too consistent, you want fluctuation and variation in your whiskey. Whiskey's a living, breathing thing in these barrels. When it's warm, it's like the pores on your skin, they'll open up, the spirit will drive into the staves, drive in further, and when it's cooler, it'll come, it'll kind of extract back out. So you want that constant movement, and that happens on a daily temperature, right? Colder in the morning, warmer in the middle of the day, even on a daily piece. So if you control it so much so, we want to have that quite natural movement still, but we're just taking out a lot of that top piece. And it's so far so good. We've got definitely a lot more experimentation around temperature control. And one of the things we actually did, we built this essentially looks like a really, really big shed tin, but it's a sort of quite delicately, sort of engineered building, with a level of we've got really thick eco wool insulation on the roofs and the walls, and we actually have a 5-meter waterfall running inside our warehouse. So we have a rainforest waterfall running in the middle of our barrel house. That water is having an impact and reducing that temperature, ensuring the humidity's there, but also just the beauty of having a waterfall in the middle of a barrel house is something to enjoy while you're sipping a whiskey.
I was gonna say that sounds like a paradise right there. Like I love that smell of walking into a rick house and looking and seeing all the barrels. But you put a waterfall in the middle of that, I'll retire there tomorrow. So one more question for you.
Yeah.
And of course, as always, there's so many things we just couldn't cover in one episode. There are other products, the Mac, these different gins, the barrel aged Mac, which is even more intriguing for me.
Barrel aged Mac is a cracker,
And you can. I encourage people to check out on the website. That we links to the website and products in the show notes for sure. So plenty of things that we didn't get to, and as they come to the U.S., if they come to the U.S., of course, but as the things come to the U.S., I'll be sure to announce them and if possible, make them available. But so the last question I wanted to ask you is about legacy. Mm-hmm. And the way that I want to frame it is that obviously Jim McEwan he's got his own legacy just by nature of what he's done. And in many ways, I think of, as I was thinking about this interview and about how Cape Byron developed, I was also thinking about the late Dr. Jim Swan, and how many distilleries he impacted over the course of his life, both through founding and consulting and all these things. Now, some of them are still pretty new and they're still kind of dependent on his legacy to build on, but some of his earlier ones, I'm thinking like Kavalon and even M&H, I would say, in Tel Aviv, these have grown so that, of course, his legacy is part of it, but they've also been able to set their own standards and legacies for what their creators are doing past Dr. Swan. So when you look to the future, you've been very clear that you want this to be a generational business, just like the family farm is, that there's no, buyout plan for this.
Yep.
So beyond the legacy that Jim McEwan brings to this brand and this distillery, what legacy do you want to be part of it?
It's a great question. We on farm, and when you see and come witness the distillery, it's literally sits in the middle and the heart of our farm. And before the distillery, we talk about the roots that were sort of planted by the family, and that really comes from our real love for land, and using, giving back and kind of trying to leave the world in a better place than what we came into it. And through the distillery as a medium, we get to use that to educate people about that. And I think spirits is one of the most incredible mediums to do that. The world, it's such a global, look at what an example here now, from the US to Australia, and the community around single malt whiskey and also gin is just incredible. But for me personally, the legacy is very much, the goal is generational. The distillery is tied to our family farm, and that's such a unique family asset that we would never be able to untie those, and nor would we, because that's just really our life's work, or the parents, and in particular, I've got a fresh baby boy who's only 4 weeks old, and and my brother's got 3 little ones, and the excitement about what a generational piece, and giving them, and also just educating, our family, our community, and generations about, what a world that they can leave, and what mark that they can sort of leave and put a stamp onto. But you look at people like the world of, you look at and track on Jim's career and the legacy that he's left. He has made such an impact on so many people, but the industry as a whole, and all through a positive light. There is not many people that have had that impact, and that's just been a dedication and a pure love for what he's done. And he has made that from staying true to his craft, and really trying to craft and show spirits that represent his area, his land, and where he's from. So I suppose from a legacy piece, if I can, I suppose, be doing that and showcasing, crafting great spirits, uncompromising quality, and really ones that showcase our land and our region, and get people inspired as well by learning and more and connecting about the land. And I'm a big believer that as a generation, that what we can do with creating great things, we can also walk hand in hand with having a positive impact in the environment as well. And I think that's when the great things happen. So yeah, I'm very much hoping that definitely in many, 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 many years to come, and that day where I'm dead and gone, that that our stills will still be running and our spirit will still be getting produced, and to have our spirit maybe enjoyed and consumed and known about throughout different parts of the world, and known for the reasons that we've been talking about today, is that would be a pretty incredible piece.
Fantastic. I think it's a great way to end this, and it's now as it is now officially tomorrow, where you are. That is a great way to end the interview. So, Eddie, thank you again for coming on, for staying up late, for coming on with a 4-week-old somewhere else, which, bravo for you. I appreciate the sacrifice on that one.
I've had 1.5 whiskeys since I've been going. I've been needing to get a little lifeblood blood going through, but it's feeding time right now. So no doubt my wife is in the room next door, and little Jude is up listening in.
Well, start them learning early. Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. We'll have more info in the show notes about where you can find the products that are in the US. If you're an international listener, you might have a little more opportunity, but hopefully as things grow and as things go, we'll get you to even more places. So hang on with me for just a second, Eddie. And this has been another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast, coming to you from New York City and from Cape Byron, Australia, in 2 different days. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next week.
Hey, folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey in My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.